Back in the summer of 2016, I got my first job at 18 years old. I was excited about the work, but not about the commute. Without traffic, it was a 30-minute drive both ways, and I normally got off work around midnight, and the last thing I wanted to do was drive a half hour to get home. During the first few weeks, I was still getting used to my new routine, and one of the first things my mother told me was to keep an eye on my gas tank, and if I ever needed more, I should leave early and stop on the way, but never on my way back. I understood her concern. I was a petite 18-year-old female, and I looked even younger. But being who I was, I half forgot, half ignored that advice. And one night on my way home, I realized I legitimately didn't have enough gas in the tank to get me to my exit. I pulled into the first station I could find, not caring about the brand or the cost of the gas. I decided to make it as quick as possible, and only put in about $10 worth, just to get myself out of there. I swiped my card and began pumping gas, and once it got to the $10 mark, I shut it off and printed out my receipt. Thinking the worst was behind me, I was about to climb back into my car and book it home, when a voice came from the tiny intercom above the pump. "Ma'am, there was a problem with your credit card payment." I paused and glanced at the guy at the counter and felt a chill spiral down my neck. He was one of those tall, gaunt, sketchy-looking clerks, and was staring right out the window at me, beckoning me to come inside. I stepped back towards the gas pump and pressed the button on the intercom. "What's wrong with my card? I have a receipt. It went through just fine." I didn't try to hide the annoyance in my voice. I didn't like the look of this guy, or the way he sounded. "I just need you to come inside, ma'am. Your receipt is incorrect. I'm going to need to run your card in here," he replied, a bit too quickly. I looked back at the guy through the window in frustration. There was no way I was going in there, where I would be alone with him. He was staring at me wide-eyed, like some kind of creep. I stood my ground, pulled out my phone, and checked my credit card app. I held it up stupidly as if he could see it from there, and I pressed the intercom button again. "It went through. I see it on my statement. I'm not coming in." "Ma'am, if you attempt to leave, I'll call the police. I have your tag number. Please come inside." I then shouted at him from across the parking lot instead of pressing the intercom. "Over $10 of gas, you're gonna call the cops? Fuck you. I'm leaving." I walked a few steps around my car and gave him the finger. I was just about to walk back around my car and climb into the driver's seat when I paused. He was mouthing something to me through the window. I would have ignored it, but he suddenly looked much more desperate than creepy. He kept beckoning me forward and calling out something that I couldn't hear through the window. I must have made a weird look, because 5 seconds later he slammed a piece of paper on the window where he had hastily written, "Guy in your car." I booked it inside the station, and once I was there, the clerk locked the door and told me to get down. He had his eyes on my car and had a gun in his hand. I squatted down behind the counter and watched the security cameras as a tall guy in sweatpants and a windbreaker nudged my back door open, slid out quickly, and jogged away into the night. I started freaking out. Turns out the clerk had noticed the guy hanging around the side of the building on the monitors, and as soon as I pulled in, he made a beeline for my car. He crouched down and opened the door, and slid himself inside as I was swiping my card, being careful not to close the door all the way behind him, so that I wouldn't hear anything. The clerk had noticed all of this on the camera, and immediately called the cops, who arrived a few minutes later. They searched the area and my car, but were not able to locate the guy, or anything that would lead back to him. The gas station clerk probably saved my life, because who knows what would have happened if I had driven off with that stranger in the back seat. I think the lesson here is obvious. It's not enough to be cautious, you have to stay alert as well. Be suspicious but not stupid. And always listen to your mom.
This creepy story happened to me about 6 months ago while I was still working at my previous job, and I thought I would share it while it still remains fresh in my mind. So I was at the office one day. I was working late and the rest of my co-workers were heading out to share a taxi home, so I was going to be the only one left in the building since our boss hadn't come into work for the past few days. I thought it was an interesting coincidence that he stopped showing up on Valentine's Day, but no one really knew for sure if he was seeing anyone, although he had been coming into work on his motorcycle a lot more often lately, whatever that was supposed to mean. I didn't really care too much about all the gossip, but I was getting kind of tired of the whole thing since it seemed it was all anyone could talk about at the time. The strong scent of perfume in the office and the mystery gift on his desk also had everyone talking. It was actually pretty cool not having the boss around at first, but unfortunately, the security alarm had started acting up and I needed his signature to approve the cost to call someone to fix it. Also, the key to the supply room went missing since he left, and he hadn't returned any of my messages about that or the alarm. Which was surprising because he was the kind of person that would generally take things very seriously. Just as my colleagues were about to leave the building, they asked if there was anyone waiting up for me because there was someone sitting inside a car in the parking lot outside. They seemed genuinely unnerved when I told them that I wasn't expecting anyone, and they all decided to quietly leave together and asked me to be careful. What was really strange is that whoever it was had no business being there, but I initially brushed it off and thought the car would be gone by the time I got around to observing the parking lot for myself. About half an hour later, I received a message on my phone from Josh, one of my co-workers from earlier. Truth be told, I was so focused on my work I had completely forgotten about the matter. I didn't respond to his message right away, but eventually I did find an excuse to pass in front of my boss's office overlooking the parking lot. I went into his office and peeked through the window. As I slowly pulled down the blinds, I was surprised to see someone still waiting in the parking lot. This was highly unusual, and it kind of creeped me out since the car was parked so close to mine. I couldn't really make out who it was, but as I looked closer I could see it was definitely a man smoking a cigarette. There was nothing familiar about him, and I didn't recognize the car. Since I was the only person at the office, I couldn't shake this uncanny feeling that he really was waiting up for me for some reason, and that it would be impossible to get to my car without him seeing me. I quickly returned to my desk and grabbed my phone so I could take a photo and confirm with Josh that it was the same car from before. While I waited for Josh to respond, the gift on the desk suddenly caught my eye. I thought that perhaps it was a perfume, which would explain the strong scent inside the office lately, but I was also curious to know if it really was a Valentine's gift and why it was still on his desk. It seemed strange to leave it at the office. As I slowly opened the box, I was surprised to see a passport inside. Suddenly I received a new message on my phone. I was initially confused by his response, but when I looked closely at the photo again, I could see that the car was empty. I was so quick to take the photo I hadn't even noticed. I immediately took another peek through the window. The car was still there, but with no one inside. It seemed so strange to abandon your car in the middle of the night, especially on a cold February night. It was getting late and I still had a few more hours of work to catch up on, so I decided to get back to it, hoping the car would be gone by the time I finished up. A few hours later, I got a little curious as to why Josh hadn't followed up with any other messages, which is when I realized that the battery on my phone was dead. I was too tired to stick around to recharge my phone at the office, so I closed up and cautiously descended into the parking lot. As I left the building, I felt a sudden chill, but I didn't know if it was from the cold air or from seeing the same old car still parked and abandoned outside. A couple of things started running through my head at that point, like maybe he had too much to drink and decided to walk home, or the car was extremely low on gas, but deep down I had a bad feeling. As I approached the abandoned car, I could see cigarette butts scattered all over the ground, everywhere, suggesting that he had been waiting for a lot longer than I thought. It seemed very bizarre to just take off after waiting for so long. I proceeded to my car and took one final look back at the office, which suddenly reminded me of the passport on the desk that I had completely forgotten to place back inside the box after getting distracted by my phone. Knowing that my boss would totally flip out if he found out that someone had been snooping around his office, I reluctantly headed back into the building, since I had already worked so late and I really didn't want to have to wake up extra early the next morning just to make sure I'd be the first to arrive at the office. I knew there was a chance that he wouldn't even show up the next day, but I wasn't going to risk it. I didn't bother turning the lights on because I knew my way around and I was going to be quick in and out. It was when I reached my boss's office that I noticed something very strange. The office chair that was previously behind the desk had been moved and both the box and the passport were missing. I had only been gone for a few minutes, so it seemed plausible that whoever it was might still be inside the building with me, so I was quick to observe the rest of the office. Despite the intense moment of silence, I started to feel somewhat relieved to see the same old familiar office that I had grown accustomed to, and there was no other indication that anyone else was there. However, this moment of silence and relief was quickly diminished by a loud thud coming from the supply room. It sounded like something very heavy hitting the floor. As I tried to figure out what could have caused such a loud noise, I suddenly heard the sound of what appeared to be a commotion coming from behind the door. After realizing that someone was in the supply room which required a key to open it, I began to assume that it was my boss or someone else with access to the office. But as I opened the door, I saw something that I will never forget and continues to haunt my darkest dreams. My knee-jerk reaction caused me to dash out of the office and immediately get to my car. Just as I was about to turn on the ignition, I instinctively looked up and saw the dark silhouette of a man standing by the same window in the office. I couldn't see a face, but I knew I was being watched. I turned the key and my heart sank as the engine failed to start. I tried again repeatedly before looking up at the office again, horrified to see that the dark figure had vanished. I gave the key one last turn, and to my relief the engine shuddered to a start. I drove off and headed to the nearest police station. When I arrived there, I told them everything. Thanks to the photo I had taken of the car that was parked outside, along with the partial description of the driver, the police were able to make an arrest, and the driver was identified. Shockingly, it turned out not to be my boss after all, but a relative of his with a violent criminal record. Apparently, my boss wanted to surprise his young girlfriend with a trip to Brazil by inviting her to his office and gifting her with a brand new passport he had arranged. But instead, she wanted to break the whole thing off, and in a fit of desperate rage, he killed her in cold blood and went into hiding. In an attempt to cover up his crime, he convinced his no-good brother to come by the office to collect the body and dispose of it. I will never forget that night, or the days I could smell her perfume as her lifeless body remained hidden behind the door while I went about my daily job. And the terrifying thought of being alone at night in the office with a violent criminal. I can only imagine what may have occurred had I not left the building or drove away soon enough. I consider myself very lucky. I never saw my boss again after that. In fact, no one did. He became a ghost. His last known location was somewhere in Rio, and that was it. A few weeks later, I quit my job and started working security at the sub-level of a local hospital. It kind of felt like a step back, and I had serious reservations about working so close to the morgue. But I didn't think anything could be worse than that creepy night at the office.
My name is Gabby, and this story is my true experience. When I was 11 years old, my family and I moved to a big house in a tiny town. Our new house was located at the highest point, which was at the end of the town. When we bought the house, the owner explained to us that his wife had just passed away due to cancer, and that the house was very precious to her, so she never wanted to sell it. Still, the owner said the house was too big and lonely for him, since all their kids were grown up and already moved to other cities. However, during the final part of the deal, he suddenly changed his mind and didn't want to sell the house. But it was too late. The owner stormed out of the office saying that it was his house and that we were going to regret it. Anyway, this was during the time my dad was sent overseas because he was in the military. So my mom, my older brother, and I had to live by ourselves for 6 months. During that time, we had really weird experiences. Sometimes we would wake up to the sound of a goat in our backyard. It would last the whole night. The next morning, we talked to the neighbors and asked if one of them had goats, but none of them did. So at first, we just decided to ignore the issue and leave it alone. Now, just for your information, our house design was kind of odd. Downstairs, we had my room, my brother's room, my soon-to-be-born sister's room, and a weird wide walkway that led to the backyard. And upstairs, we had a kitchen, living room, and my parents' room. The downstairs was underground, and the upstairs was technically the first floor. Anyway, one night, I decided to sleep with my mom, so I went upstairs with my brother. Later that night, we heard a sharp scream coming from downstairs. It sounded like it was my dad's voice screaming for help. He was calling all of our names. My mom rushed out of the room and was ready to run downstairs. All of a sudden, she stopped at the top of the staircase and looked at us with a weird expression on her face. "But your dad is still in Colombia. How could he?" And the next thing I saw was my mom abruptly falling down the stairs. That moment was so horrible. It was like someone pushed her backwards before she was able to resist. My brother called the police and I ran down the stairs to check my mom and see if she was okay. We struggled to bring her up the stairs, but we managed to make it to her room. When the police and ambulance arrived, they took my mom to a hospital and left 2 officers with us that night. I was crying the entire night, and we were so afraid. Due to falling down the stairs, Mom was injured, and unfortunately, we lost our new family member. The most chilling part was that they found large handprints on my mom's back, as if she was pushed by someone. This led to an investigation, but they had to leave the case open because no one was found in our house, other than the 3 of us. We all suffered and went through a hard time that year, especially my mom. She slid into depression. When she recovered, we moved the following year. However, more things happened throughout the year, but not as bad as the previous one. Just footsteps, broken plates, or similar stuff to that. We put that house on the market when we left, but no one has contacted us. One thing is for certain. I hope that we never have to go back to that creepy house again. I really, really don't want to go back.